The days are getting cold and dark and rainy, and it's no longer fun to go outside with my food scrap bucket to dump it in my compost bin. So what to do? Hey folks, my name is Tara and I live in the Bay Area and I compost everything. Every little food scrap, every piece of paper, every leaf, I compost it all. And even for me, though our winters are mild, I don't always feel like going outside to dump my food scraps. But we really don't want to put our food scraps in the landfill. So what options do we have to compost indoors? Particularly if you live in an apartment where you don't have the option of composting, or if you live in a place where the winters are so cold that your compost bins are frozen shut. Fortunately, there are options for those of us that can't compost outdoors. There's actually three options. There's vermicomposting or composting with worms. There is the electronic kitchen top composter. And then there is Bokashi. Bokashi. Say that and impress your friends. Now, I have made detailed videos on vermicomposting as well as the kitchen top composter, and I will put links to that at the end of this. But vermicomposting, it's like taking care of pets because you've got living creatures that you've got to keep alive and happy. And then with the electronic kitchen composter, they tend to be a little bit pricey, so not in everybody's budget. Now, Bokashi, on the other hand, is very doable, and I've actually been trialing it for the past 8 weeks or so. So we're going to rewind the clock, and I'm going to share with you the entire process of setting up the Bokashi system, all that I learned along the way, the pros, the cons, and then we're actually going to bury the Bokashi compost in the garden and see how that does, so that you have all the information you need to decide whether or not Bokashi is right for you. So what is Bokashi and why is it different? Now, Bokashi is a Japanese term that loosely translates to fermented organic matter. It is a method that was popularized in the early 1980s by Dr. Teruo Higa, and it has gained a lot of popularity since because of the promise of fast composting with no smells and the fact that you can compost dairy and meats and other things that typically they don't recommend in other composting systems. Now, Dr. Higa developed these what he calls effective microbes, or EM1, that are anaerobic bacteria that actually work in an air-free environment, and those microbes are essential to pickle the food scraps and make them readily decomposable when you put them in soil. And that's why the process is so fast, because it really doesn't actually create compost. It creates what some people call a bio-pulp that is then buried in your garden and very quickly turns into compost, much faster than other methods of composting. So here's my DIY Bokashi bin sitting in my laundry room. So let's rewind the clock 8 weeks ago and I'll show you how I got it all set up. Okay, to get your Bokashi system set up, you need some very basic things that you probably have in your house already. You'll need 2 buckets. 5-gallon buckets are sufficient. In one of them, you're going to drill a bunch of holes, and then the other does not have any holes in it, and you will need a lid, a nice tight-fitting lid for the bucket with the holes. Then you're going to be needing the secret ingredient, which is the Bokashi Bran, and this has been inoculated with lactobacillus bacteria and other anaerobic bacteria that are going to work the magic on the food scraps. You are going to need something like a brick to prevent these 2 buckets from sticking to each other when you put one into the other, especially as it gets more and more heavy with food waste. It's going to be really hard to separate them because you're going to create some kind of a vacuum seal in there that's going to hold the 2 buckets together. So this will really make a difference. And finally, you're going to be needing some kind of fabric that will serve as a filter at the bottom of the bucket with the holes, and then you're going to need something to put on top of your food scraps to really push them down. And you can use this potato masher as a tamper to push your food scraps down, because remember, this is an anaerobic process. Let's go ahead and get it set up. So let's put our filter at the bottom. And then I'm going to be adding a pretty generous amount of Bokashi to get things started, because what you do not want to happen is have bad bacteria outcompete the Bokashi bacteria. So especially as you kickstart it, I'm putting a good cup or so of this inoculated bran at the bottom. There we go. And now all I need to do is add my food scraps. For every 2 inches or so of food scraps, I'm going to be adding another couple of tablespoons of Bokashi Bran on top. This is actually food scraps, believe it or not, from another experiment that I'm doing with a tabletop kitchen composter. So that goes in the bottom. I also got some kale and some tomatoes with blossom and rot, some cucumbers, and then I'm going to add some Bokashi Bran on top of this. I'm going to add a good handful because, like I said, when you jumpstart the process with good bacteria, it really helps prevent the bacteria that you don't want from taking over. And now all we need to do is put this brick in here. Let's stack it. I'm going to put this plastic on. And this lid. And I'm really going to push it down with this lid. Now, every couple of days or so, I'm going to come and check to see whether there is any liquid accumulated at the bottom, and I will discard that. So let's check in a couple of days, and I'm also going to be adding food scraps over the next couple of weeks or so until this bin is relatively full, maybe about at the 3/4 point. I ended up adding a spigot eventually because it became a real pain to lift that bucket to drain the liquid. I'm using the spigot that I use for my 1/2-inch irrigation tubing, and I'm using a 3/4-inch drill bit to drill a hole in the bucket. You want to push it in. See, it's just fitting. It should be nice and tight. So let's see how the Bokashi bin is doing. It's about halfway full. And I can still smell food. Definitely nothing rotting, which is a good thing. And I've got some kitchen scraps. I've got pasta and all kinds of things in here. Coffee grinds, onions, what have you. You can grab a handful of this Bokashi Bran and just kind of sprinkle it all over. Good. And then all I'm going to do is push it down properly so I get all the air out. I'm going to put this lid on, push it down some more. It's looking good. And then really important that you close the lid very, very tightly. It's been about 3 or 4 weeks since I started this Bokashi bin, and it is finally full. Now, how long it takes to fill really depends on how much food scraps you produce. I've actually been sharing some of the food scraps with my worm bin, so it's taken a little bit longer, but it is full, and we have to put it away for a couple of weeks undisturbed. And I have also got a replacement bin. This time I actually went and got a professionally made bin, just because I want to see what all the hype is about. Is a professionally made bin in any way better than my DIY construct over here? Well, we're gonna find out. Now, one of the things that you will continue to need to do is every couple of days, you're going to need to drain the liquid that is going to continue to flow out of the ferment, even when it's been put away undisturbed for 2 weeks. Let's go ahead and do that now so you can see what it looks like and how much we have. It's been about maybe 3 days since I last drained it. I'm actually standing it on top of this bin to drain it because I have a feeling there might be quite a bit of liquid in here. See how much that's flowing? I have a feeling I'm going to need more than this cup. Now, the liquid and the fermenting mixture does have kind of a smell. I wouldn't call it odorless, but it's not a bad smell. Well, my husband thinks it's a bad smell, but I don't. It definitely does not smell of rotting food. It's just like something fermenting, and if you don't like the smell of fermenting stuff, then you won't like the smell of this. I've got a bigger container. So you can see there's quite a bit of liquid. Now, I will tell you that when I first started filling this bin, there was practically no liquid, I think at least for a good week or 10 days. But then as the food started fermenting, as I added more liquidy foods to it, the liquids started to build up. Now, this is great fertilizer, diluted 1:50, and use it for your plants, or you can pour it down your faucet and let it sit for an hour overnight, and it will really help break down any grime that's developing in your plumbing. So really good use of that. So let's take a peek inside this before we put it away. To tell you the truth, you shouldn't expect to see any dramatic transformation. It's all going to still look like fermenting food. Yeah, that's what it looks like. And it's only after you bury it in your soil for a couple of weeks or so that's when it really starts to disintegrate. Okay, so this is the bin that's been sitting for a couple of weeks. Let's open it. Wow, that's looking actually pretty good. Now, I wasn't expecting it to be completely decomposed or anything. It looked just kind of like it was when I put it over there to stew. But it has got a lot of white stuff developing around it, and it has been fermenting, believe it or not. So now when I put it in the garden, I'm going to bury it in the garden, and it should decompose within a couple of weeks or so. And because it's been fermenting, the smell of the food is no longer there. There is no smell practically, not even the smell of fermentation. Definitely not something that's going to interest any critter. So let's go bury it in the garden, and then we'll check again in a couple of weeks to see how it's doing. Okay, so I've dug a couple of holes and I'm going to be burying it here. I'm going to leave a little bit for my worms because I want to see whether they like it. Here's the cloth that I put in. I'm gonna have to reuse that, so take that. And yeah, there's a little bit of a vinegary smell. Keep this for my worms. Bury it up. Right, let's see what happens. Let's see what my worms think. Pretty dry on the top here. Take this layer off. Put it underneath. So it's time to go check on our bokashi that we had buried in the soil a few weeks ago. But before that, I wanted to share with you some of the learnings I had through this process, the pros and cons, if you will, and what I learned, so that you can have a little bit more insight into what's good about it and maybe what's not so good and decide whether it's the right thing for you. So the first thing, the pros, it's really, really easy to do. It's almost impossible to mess up, but there are a couple of things that can go wrong, which I will talk about in the cons. The second thing is it is convenient. You can compost very discreetly in any climate, be that the heart of the coldest winter, or if you're just not feeling like going out in the middle of the night to dump compost in your compost bin, you can compost indoors, and you can keep that biopulp indoors for pretty much as long as you like. You don't even have to put it in the garden like I did after a few weeks. You can just leave it in your house, in your garage, and wait until spring or whenever you feel like it, and just keep stacking those bins with your food scraps until you're ready to put it in your garden. And it's also supposed to be really fast. Now, if we are able to get it done in 8 weeks, as most of the materials suggest that it's possible, that is really fast composting. Most composting takes a minimum of 4 to 6 months, maybe even a year to actually get to that stage where you can plant in it. So getting it done in 8 weeks is pretty remarkable. Now, another thing is you can compost pretty much anything. That is a huge benefit of Bokashi composting. You don't have to worry about too much garlic or onions or citrus like you would if you had a worm bin. You don't have to worry about cooked food. You can actually put meat, dairy, cooked foods, pasta, anything in it. Now you will have to chop it to a reasonable size. They recommend about 1-inch size pieces or less. And things like hard bones will not break down. So if they are very flexible, thin, skinny bones, yes, they will break down. But you can put meat and dairy products, which is not something that is recommended in any other composting system. Now, you should stay away from oils because that will upset the balance of the microbial activity. But other than that, it's a free-for-all. Pretty much anything that used to be alive can go in your Bokashi bin. Another really big benefit is in the Bokashi setup, there is no smell at all of rotten food if you're doing it right. Now, if you let your food scraps sit on your kitchen counter for 3-4 days and you open it, it's gonna stink. But if you're putting it into your Bokashi setup every couple of days or so, there will be absolutely no smell at all. There's also no issues with pests. Most indoor compost systems, like vermicompost systems, will have the issue of gnats, fruit flies flying around them if you don't really properly cover them with brown material. But in the Bokashi system, it's an airtight system and nothing can get in. Another huge benefit is all of the nutrients in the Bokashi system are maintained, the food scraps that you put in. In other systems, like your outdoor compost bin, as you put water in it, as things start to evaporate, gases, etc., you will lose some of the nutrients that are in the compost. Not in the Bokashi system. It's all maintained within the system, and when you put it in your garden, that's exactly where it goes, and it stays and feeds your plants. And then there is the byproduct, the leachate, if you will, the Bokashi tea that you can drain from your Bokashi system that actually is a pretty good fertilizer. Now, you do have to watch out for a couple of things. For example, because you're putting cooked foods into it, there will be extra salt typically in the leachate, and plants don't like that. So you will need to dilute it quite a bit. I'd suggest 1:50, 1:100, but dilute the heck out of that thing, and don't use it for your container gardens. Use it only in ground, because that thing will wash off and leach out into the soil much better than it will in your containers, where it will tend to accumulate. And also know that it is a little bit low in nitrogen. I read somewhere that there is some kind of denitrification process that happens in the Bokashi composting, so you will need to add additional nitrogen to the fertilizer. It is not a complete fertilizer, but it's great. And you can also use it in your plumbing, like I said earlier, to clean things out if you don't want to use it in your garden. So what are some of the things that can go wrong with your Bokashi system? Well, the main thing to remember is that these effective microbes are anaerobic, so they need an airtight environment. So if you're not compressing the food scraps well enough, getting most of the air out, and if you're not covering it, this is even more important, really, really tightly on the top, then the anaerobic bacteria just don't have the right environment to do their thing. The other thing that can go wrong is if you're putting moldy food scraps into your Bokashi system. Now, moldy food scraps already contain other bacteria that have started working on them, and they can compete with the bacteria that is in the Bokashi system, and that could throw things out of balance. But other than that, there's very little that can go wrong with your Bokashi system. It is really very easy to do. And then the other con, since we're talking about the cons, is also the cost of the Bokashi brand. It is something that you will need to purchase if you don't want to make it yourself. Now, there is a DIY way of making the Bokashi brand, and I'm going to put a link to what's probably the best video on the internet. It's by Fraser Valley Farm. He does an incredible job of describing the entire process if you want to make it yourself, and I will put a link to that video at the end of this. And at some point I'm going to try, maybe not making it completely from scratch, but actually getting what's called the EM1 microbe liquid and then getting my own brand and adding it to it, which also should be much cheaper than actually buying the brand. And then if you're an apartment dweller and you do not have access to any kind of garden, even a balcony garden, is that bio-pulp or the fermented food scraps that you need to figure out what to do with. Now, you can find a gardener neighbor somewhere around you that you can donate it to. You can make what's called a soil factory, where you actually have a tote with potting soil, and then you can put this into it, and then it will decompose in that, and it will make wonderful soil that you can use if you've got a balcony garden, as an example, or you can give it to a friend. And there's also a website called, I believe it's called makesoil.org, where you can connect with people who would be happy to take your food scraps that have been converted into this biopulp. It is absolutely phenomenal for the garden. So now let's go check on how our biopulp is decomposing into the soil. By the way, folks, if you are getting value from this video, I sure would appreciate a thumbs up. It really helps the video get out to a broader audience, and the more people that try to compost indoors, the less food that is going to the landfill. So please do give this video a thumbs up and let's help it spread around. Thank you so much. Okay, so it's been roughly 4 weeks or so since we buried our Bokashi bio-pulp in here. And let's dig it up today and see how it's doing. Now I had put some leaves over here and covered it up, but I know that I had buried it roughly in this general space. So let's take out the leaves and see what's happening in here. I can see some peanut shells, but they are nice and soft. Breaks apart very easily. A little bit of eggshell, so I know that the bokashi is in this space. Where did I lose my hori tool? Right there. I always lose it. Wow. Look at that. Right away I can see a ton of worms. Yep, the worms really like this stuff. I've got an avocado skin full of peanut shells, so it looks like those don't break down as easily. But other than that, I can see some paper towels. Just a lot of life, a lot of worm activity going on in here. Look at that big guy. So clearly the worms love it, and oh, look at that. A lot of the biopulp still in here. So I think this needs to go for maybe another week or two, but it's definitely breaking down. There's a little bit of smell, not much. Let's see over here. I think I had some buried in here as well. Yeah, but most of it is soil. You can see there's clumps of this biopulp that are taking a little bit longer, but and then there's eggshells. Of course, those will take forever. Now, what I learned was I need to pulverize my eggshells before I put it in here. But for the most part, this is looking good. I mean, I've got an avocado stone here. That's still pretty hard. But those usually take a long time to break down in any compost. It goes through several iterations. But it eventually becomes kind of smushy and breaks down. But yeah, for the most part, other than the avocado skins, the peanut shells, and a little bit of biopulp here and there, and the eggshells, this is all soil, you guys, and it's nutrient dense soil, and lots of worms. So I am liking this, and my soil life is liking it as well. Let's go ahead and cover it up. We'll take a look at the worm bin and see how that's doing. Now I had come and put the bin in which I had the bokashi in the second layer here because worms like a little bit of pressure on the top, and I'd also put some leaves over it. So it was on this side that I had my bokashi. Yeah, the worms are all here and they seem nice and happy. So clearly the acidity of the bokashi is not bothering them one bit. Yeah, it's just a lot of worm activity. Yep. Whew, look at that, you guys. They clearly love the bokashi. So I am going to be adding more of it going forward. Looking on this side, the side that did not have the bokashi. Yeah, there are some worms, but a lot of it is castings. So they have clearly moved on to this side, which is where the good stuff is. Yep, so in limited quantities, you can feed your worms bokashi pulp because they like it, but the acidity might get to them for a few days. So make sure that they've got other places to go to. In my case, I've got multiple worm bins stacked one on top of the other, so they've got lots of places to go. This is a lovely bin. And I got this for free actually on Nextdoor, but it's called a Worm Factory. I think it's called a Worm Factory 360. So I did a video on how I set this up, and I will put a link to it at the end of this video. So now I am keen to make a soil factory and see how my bokashi pulp decomposes into that and builds great soil for me. In the meanwhile, if you want to watch a video on how to do vermicomposting, it is right here. And that electronic kitchen composter, if you want my honest opinion, right here.